The fluorescent lights of the lecture hall were clinical, aggressive, bleaching the room into a sterile white that made my headache throb behind my eyes. But the moment I blinked, the brightness vanished, replaced by the sensory memory of a dark corner and the rough texture of a studio wall against my back. I could still taste the sharp, metallic tang of adrenaline, mixed with the lingering, expensive sweetness of her lipstick. It was a ghost sensation, haunting my mouth, completely at odds with the woman standing at the podium. Dr. Elena Calloway, the visiting critic, the academic executioner whose reputation for shredding careers was whispered about in the hallways like a ghost story. She adjusted her glasses, her fingers long and deliberate, and for a second, the room spun, because those were the same hands that had tangled in my hair 3 nights ago. The same hands that now held my thesis, my entire future, were the ones I had pinned against a doorframe in a moment of reckless, blinding heat. She looked up, scanning the room, and her gaze slid over me without a flicker of recognition. But I knew. I knew the pulse that had hammered against my palm just hours before. It had started at the blind canvas party, a pretentious, mandatory ritual for the MFA cohort that sat somewhere between a networking event and a collective nervous breakdown. The concept was simple. Everyone wore masks to separate the ego from the body, theoretically allowing the art to speak for itself. In reality, it was just a room full of anxious artists in cheap disguises, drinking wine that tasted like vinegar and judgment. The air in the gallery space was thick, humid with body heat and the smell of damp wool, expensive cologne, and the faint, underlying scent of turpentine that never really washed out of our clothes. The atmosphere was coiled tight. You could feel the competitive tension vibrating in the floorboards. Everyone was a rival here. Every conversation was a performance, a way to position yourself before the final thesis review. I hated it. I hated the posturing, the way eyes darted around the room assessing value rather than connection. I needed to breathe. I slipped away from a debate about the commodification of trauma and pushed through the heavy glass doors to the balcony. The cold air hit me like a physical slap, grounding and immediate. The city noise below was a dull roar, a comfort compared to the sharp, cutting laughter inside. I leaned against the railing, the metal freezing through my thin shirt, and closed my eyes. That's when I felt the shift in air pressure, the subtle displacement that happens when someone commands a space. "You're missing the performance," a voice said. It wasn't a question. It was low, textured, with a cadence that didn't sound like a student. I turned. She was leaning against the brickwork, watching me. She wore a minimalist silver mask that covered the upper half of her face, leaving only a sharp jawline and a mouth painted a deep oxblood red exposed. She wasn't wearing the thrifted, chaotic fashion of my peers. She was in a structureless silk suit that whispered when she moved, looking like a splash of mercury in the dark. "I prefer the rehearsal," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "The performance feels rehearsed." She tilted her head, and even behind the mask, I could feel the weight of her assessment. It was unflinching. That's the point, isn't it? The masquerade isn't the masks we're wearing tonight. It's the pretense that any of us know what we're doing. Her critique was sharp, devoid of the academic jargon everyone inside was using as a shield. She stepped closer, and the scent of sandalwood and rain, something clean and expensive, cut through the stagnant party air. She wasn't just making small talk. She was testing the perimeter. "You sound like you've seen through the trick," I countered, turning fully to face her. "Or maybe you're just bored." "Boredom is a useful critique," she murmured. She stepped into my space, dissolving the polite distance between strangers. The tension wasn't intellectual anymore. It was physical, a sudden, magnetic pull that made the hair on my arms stand up. "It tells you what isn't working." "And what isn't working?" I asked, my voice dropping. "The distance," she said. The conversation snapped. One moment we were sparring with words, and the next, she stepped into the negative space between us. It wasn't tentative. It was a collision of frustration and sudden, overwhelming attraction. Her hand came up to cup my jaw, her thumb tracing the line of my cheekbone with a deliberation that made my pulse stutter. I didn't pull away. I leaned in. The kiss was a shock to the system. Hot, demanding, and utterly consuming. My hands found the silk of her lapels, pulling her closer until there was no air left between us. She tasted of wine and something darker, something dangerous. We were pressed against the cold railing, a friction of bodies in the dark, hidden from the party but completely exposed to each other. It was a moment of pure, unthinking instinct, a release of all the pressure that had been building for months. Then the heavy glass doors creaked open, spilling yellow light and noise onto the balcony. She pulled away instantly, the loss of contact leaving me physically cold. Before I could say a word, before I could ask her name, she turned and disappeared into the crowd, her silk suit blending into the shadows. I was left alone, breathless, with the taste of her on my lips and the scent of sandalwood clinging to my skin. The memory looped in my head all weekend, a fever dream I couldn't shake, right up until the moment I walked into the lecture hall and saw her standing there, holding the syllabus that would define my career. The transition from the velvet dark of the balcony to the aggressive fluorescence of Studio 4 was violent. The Monday morning sun glared off the white walls, exposing every dust mote, every dried paint splatter, and every hungover regret in the room. The department head, a man who loved the sound of his own voice, was droning on about prestige and opportunity, but the words dissolved into static. I was gripping the edge of my drafting table, my knuckles white, trying to force my heart rate back down to a double-digit rhythm. The room felt sterile, silent, and terrifyingly expectant. Then the door opened, and the air didn't just shift, it solidified. "I'd like to introduce Dr. Elena Calloway," the department head announced, gesturing with a flourish that felt absurdly theatrical for 9 a.m. "She will be the visiting critic deciding the fate of your final showcase." She walked in, and my stomach dropped straight through the floor. The silver mask was gone, obviously, replaced by severe, thick-rimmed glasses and an expression of bored intelligence that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. But the architecture of her face was undeniable. I knew the sharp angle of that jawline. I knew the exact curve of her throat because I had buried my face there less than 72 hours ago. She wore a charcoal blazer now, tailored to within an inch of its life, buttoned high, shielding the skin I had touched. The contrast was a physical shock, a sensory dissonance that made me dizzy. The sensory memory of her hands gripping my waist clashed violently with this image of professional distance. She didn't smile. She moved to the podium, placed a leather folio on the surface, and looked up. "Good morning," she said. The voice was the final nail in the coffin. It was the same low, crisp timbre that had whispered critiques of the party into my ear, only now it was projected, commanding, discussing grading criteria and intellectual rigor. Hearing that tone, stripped of the intimacy of the dark, felt like a violation. It was a secret being broadcast on a public frequency. I tried to make myself small, to hide behind the canvas on my easel, but there was nowhere to go. She began to review the syllabus, pacing slowly across the front of the room. "I am not here to validate your egos," she said, her heels clicking a sharp, rhythmic cadence against the concrete floor. "I am here to see if you have anything to say that hasn't already been said better by someone else." As she spoke, her gaze swept the room, dissecting the cohort row by row. I held my breath, praying for invisibility, but it was futile. Her eyes landed on me. It lasted only a fraction of a second, a pause in the sweep of a lighthouse beam. But I saw it. There was no smile, no widening of surprise, just a tiny, almost imperceptible tightening of the muscles around her eyes. A recognition. She knew. The heat flushed up my neck, instantaneous and betrayal bright. She didn't acknowledge it. She simply turned back to the whiteboard, seamlessly continuing her sentence about composition. But the air between us had pulled taut. "Let's see the work," she commanded, closing the syllabus. The critique began, and it was a bloodbath. She moved through the studio spaces with the efficiency of a surgeon, tearing apart my peers' work with words that were polite, precise, and absolutely devastating. She stopped at Jason's station, a landscape painter everyone fawned over, and dismantled his color theory in 3 sentences, proving she wasn't here to make friends. She was here to hunt. Then she reached my corner. My work was nothing like the others. It was large, messy, visceral. Oil paint layered thick, charcoal slashed across the surface in frantic energy. It was a study in chaos, a rejection of the clean lines she seemed to embody. Elena stopped. The silence that followed stretched until it physically hurt, a tension that hummed in my teeth. She didn't look at me. She stared at the canvas, her expression unreadable. "This is unrestrained," she said finally, her voice dropping to that lower register, the one that vibrated in my chest. She stepped closer, invading the personal space of the painting. "Technically, it's a disaster. You have no control over your medium." My hands curled into fists. But then she turned, looking at me over the rim of her glasses, and the intensity of her gaze pinned me to the wall. "But the composition has an undeniable hunger," she murmured, the word hanging heavy in the sterile air. "It's desperate, and that is the only interesting thing in this room." She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving me shaking, unsure if I had just been praised, warned, or seduced all over again. Late nights became the only reality I knew, a blurry loop of caffeine and fumes where time dissolved into the grayscale of the studio windows. The art building after midnight was a ghost town, a cavernous concrete lung that breathed in the silence of the city and exhaled the sharp, chemical bite of turpentine. It was a smell that stuck to the back of my throat, a constant reminder of the work that wasn't working. I was the only one left on the 3rd floor, fighting a losing war with a 6-foot canvas that refused to behave. My hands were stained charcoal black, my shirt ruined, and my patience shredded. I was trying to force structure onto the chaos she had critiqued, trying to tame the hunger she had seen. But every brushstroke felt like a lie. I stepped back, wiping sweat from my forehead with the back of a dirty wrist, and glared at the wet oil paint. The silence was absolute, the kind of heavy quiet you only get in institutional buildings when the ventilation cycles down. Then the air changed. I didn't hear footsteps. I felt the shift in the room's density before I saw her. I turned, my heart hammering a sudden, violent rhythm against my ribs. Elena was standing in the doorway. She wasn't supposed to be here. The building was locked to non-students after 10, and the faculty offices were dark. But there she was, the silver moonlight from the hallway cutting a sharp silhouette against the gloom. She had shed the blazer, standing there in a silk blouse with the sleeves rolled up, looking less like a critic and more like a woman who couldn't sleep. "You're fighting it," she said. Her voice wasn't projected now. It was soft, intimate, sliding through the empty space between us like smoke. "I'm fixing it," I corrected, my voice raspy from hours of disuse. Or trying to. She didn't apologize for the intrusion. She didn't explain why she was wandering the studio floors at 2 a.m. She simply stepped into the room, the heavy door clicking shut behind her, sealing us in. The lecture hall hierarchy evaporated. Here, in the dark, with the smell of drying paint and the hum of the city outside. She wasn't a professor. She was just a woman, standing too close. She circled the easel, her movements slow, predatory. She stopped inches from my shoulder, close enough that I could feel the tension radiating from her. She studied the canvas, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "You're trying to paint what you think I want to see," she murmured, her eyes still on the work. "You're suffocating the composition with logic. It's boring." "You told me it lacked control," I snapped, the frustration of the week boiling over. I turned to face her, ignoring the warning bells in my head. "You told me it was a disaster." "I told you it was desperate," she countered, her gaze finally snapping to mine. The intensity in her eyes was startling. There is a difference between control and repression. You're repressing the instinct because you're afraid of it. "I'm not afraid," I lied. "Aren't you?" She stepped closer. The argument was intellectual, a debate about form and structure. But the subtext was screaming. We weren't talking about the painting. We were talking about the balcony. We were talking about the way her breath had hitched when I touched her waist. "You're the one who walked away," I whispered, the accusation hanging heavy in the air. She froze. The professional veneer cracked, just for a second, revealing something raw underneath. She looked at me, really looked at me, her gaze tracing the line of my throat, the charcoal smudge on my cheek. The warmth of her skin hit me again, radiating through the silk, undeniable, and it paralyzed me. My hands were dirty, useless at my sides, but I wanted to reach out. I wanted to ruin the silk of her blouse with the oil paint on my fingers. "The work unsettles me," she admitted, her voice dropping to a register that vibrated in my spine. "It's too loud. It demands too much." "Maybe you just don't know how to answer it," I challenged, stepping into her orbit. The air between us charged, heavy and electric, a physical weight pressing against my chest. She reached out, her hand lifting as if to touch the canvas, or maybe my face. Her fingers hovered, inches from my shoulder, trembling slightly. My throat went dry. I waited for the contact, for the collision, for the inevitable crash. But she pulled back. The movement was sharp, violent in its restraint. She straightened her spine, shoving her hands deep into her pockets and turning her shoulder to me. She looked at her hand as if it had betrayed her, then shoved it into her pocket. "Fix the composition," she commanded, her voice brittle, "and go home. You look exhausted." She turned and walked out before I could exhale, the door clicking shut with a finality that left me standing alone in the dark, breathless, angry, and more inspired than I had been in months. The mid-semester donor gala was less of a celebration and more of a hostage situation with an open bar. Attendance was mandatory, which meant I was currently standing in a corner of the main gallery, wearing a dress I couldn't afford, a vintage black slip that felt dangerously thin against the aggressive air conditioning, and holding a glass of lukewarm white wine I was afraid to drink. The room was a sea of black tie and checkbooks, populated by the kind of people who bought art to match their sofas rather than to feel anything. It was loud, a cacophony of polite laughter and the clinking of crystal that grated against my nerves like sandpaper. But the real noise, the only frequency I was actually tuned into, was her. Elena was the gravitational singularity of the room. She was wearing black velvet tonight, a column of dark fabric that left her shoulders bare and caught the gallery lights every time she moved. She was terrifyingly attractive, radiating a cold, polished elegance that made the rest of us look like we were playing dress-up. I watched her from the shadows of a large sculpture, feeling like a child, pressing her nose against the glass of a candy shop. She was charming a circle of donors, her head tilted back, her smile practiced and dazzling. Then I saw him, a wealthy gallery owner from the city, a man with silvering hair and a suit that cost more than my entire tuition. He was a peer of hers, someone who belonged in her world of tenure and accolades. He leaned in close to say something, placing a hand familiarly on her bare arm. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull away like she had with me in the studio. She laughed, a genuine, comfortable sound that cut through the room noise and lodged itself straight in my chest. Jealousy didn't just flare, it burned. It wasn't just that he was touching her, it was the ease of it, the public legitimacy of it. He could stand next to her in the light, while I was relegated to the dark corners, a dirty secret covered in charcoal and oil paint. I felt small. I felt foolish. The hunger she had praised in my work suddenly felt like a weakness, a gaping mouth that she was starving on purpose. I couldn't watch it anymore. The air in the gallery felt too thin, the perfume of the donors too cloying. I turned and shoved my way through the crowd, ducking into the narrow corridor leading to the loading dock. It was a service area, filled with stacked crates and the hum of the HVAC system, but it was away from the eyes of the donors. I leaned back against the concrete wall, closing my eyes, trying to regulate my breathing. "You're hiding." The voice came from the end of the hall. I snapped my eyes open. Elena was there. She had followed me, stopping just at the edge of the light from the main gallery. Caterers were shouting orders just around the corner, their voices echoing off the cement. But in this strip of shadow, we were alone. "I'm not hiding," I lied, my voice shaking slightly. "I'm taking a break from the performance." "You're upset," she observed. She stepped into the corridor, glancing back toward the party before moving closer. The faint trace of her perfume, something floral and sharp tonight, overpowered the smell of dust. "Is it the wine or the company?" "It's you," I spat out, the anger overriding my common sense. "I'm tired of watching you pretend. Out there, you're the ice queen. You let that man touch you like it's nothing, but you won't even look at me when we're in the same room." "He is a colleague," she said, her voice dropping, the velvet of her tone matching her dress. "And you are a student whose thesis I am grading. There are lines, and I am trying very hard to keep them." "You didn't care about lines on the balcony," I countered, stepping forward. "I didn't know who you were," she said quickly. "Liar." The word hung between us. She went still. Her composure cracked, leaving her expression raw in the dim industrial light. She took a step toward me, invading my space, her eyes dark and searching. "You're right," she whispered, the admission tearing out of her. "I knew. I recognized you the moment I walked into that lecture hall. I saw the way you held your pen, the way you sat, and I knew exactly whose mouth I had tasted. And it terrified me." "Why?" I breathed. "Because they are watching," she hissed, glancing toward the sound of the caterers. "That man, the gallery owner, he asked about you. He asked why I was looking at the corner of the room. Do you understand how dangerous this is?" She was inches away now. We were hidden only by the shadows, invisible to the world outside, but one wrong turn away from exposure. The desire was palpable, a physical weight that made the air heavy. I could see the pulse fluttering in her throat. My gaze dropped to her lips, that ox-blood red, and then back to her eyes. She wasn't the critic now. She was just Elena. "Tell me to stop," I whispered, leaning in. "I can't," she breathed. She leaned forward, her breath hitching, warm against my cheek. Her hand came up, hovering near my waist, trembling with the effort of not touching me. We were a breath away from disaster, from a kiss that would shatter every ethical boundary left standing. Footsteps echoed on the concrete. We sprang apart like guilty teenagers, putting 3 feet of distance between us, just as a server rounded the corner, carrying a tray of empty glasses. He froze, looking from my flushed face to Elena's rigid posture. "Sorry," he mumbled, ducking his head and hurrying past us toward the kitchen. Elena smoothed her dress, her hands shaking. She stared at the floor, unable to meet my eyes. "Go home," she said, her voice hollow. I turned on my heel, walking out into the cold night air without looking back. The drive home was silent and lonely, the city blurring past my window. But the stakes had shifted. It wasn't just a crush anymore. It was dangerous. And as I stared at the red taillights ahead of me, I realized I didn't care about the danger. I just wanted the fire. The week following the gala was a masterclass in erasure. Elena didn't just ignore me, she actively erased me. She focused entirely on her clipboard whenever I was near, refusing to lift her head. She skipped my studio rotation, sending a generic email about administrative conflicts. And when we passed in the hallway, she checked her watch or adjusted her glasses, finding any excuse not to acknowledge my existence. The silence was worse than her criticism. At least when she was tearing my work apart, she was engaging with it. Now, I was nothing. The rejection seeped into my hands, making my brushstrokes stiff, angry, and defensive. I was painting armor instead of art, and the canvas looked dead. Then the storm hit. It was a torrential, late-season downpour that battered the city, turning the sky a bruised purple and rattling the single-pane windows of the studio building. The power flickered and died around 8, plunging the third floor into a gray, aqueous gloom. But I refused to leave. I was working by the strobe light flashes of lightning and the ambient glow of the street lamps below, fueled by a mixture of caffeine and spite. I didn't hear the door open over the thunder. I only knew she was there because the smell of ozone and rain suddenly intensified, carrying a cold draft from the hallway. I turned. Elena was standing just inside the threshold. She was soaked, her trench coat dark with water, her hair plastered to her neck. She looked less like a figure of authority and more like something the storm had blown in. "I left files," she said, her voice tight, competing with the drumming of the rain against the glass. "For the board review." "The office is on the second floor," I said, not putting down my charcoal. "This is the third. I know where I am." She didn't move to leave. She stood there, dripping on the concrete floor, watching me. The studio felt suddenly microscopic, the storm outside sealing us into a private, pressurized capsule. The tension was sharp, brittle. "You're avoiding me," I said, the accusation slipping out before I could check it. "I am being professional," she countered, stepping further into the room. She looked exhausted, the lines of her face drawn tight. "I am protecting my tenure. Do you have any idea how fragile my position is? One rumor, one suggestion of impropriety, and 15 years of work evaporates." "So that's it?" I threw the charcoal down, the snap echoing in the quiet moments between thunderclaps. "You're going to pretend the balcony didn't happen? Pretend the closet didn't happen? You're treating art like it's a safe, sterile thing you can grade. But you told me to be honest. You told me to bleed on the canvas. And now you're terrified because I'm the only one actually doing it." "I am not terrified," she hissed, closing the distance between us. "I am trying to keep you from destroying your career before it starts." "My career isn't the one you're worried about," I challenged. "You're hiding, Elena. You're hiding behind the syllabus and the board and your tenure because it's safer than admitting you want this." "I don't..." "Liar." The word hung there, vibrating in the charged air. She stared at me, her chest heaving, the water dripping from her hair onto the silk of her blouse. The lightning flashed, illuminating the raw panic and the undeniable hunger in her eyes. Then, the dam broke. She didn't walk. She crossed the room in 2 strides, a blur of motion that ended with her body colliding with mine. There was no hesitation this time, no hovering hands or second thoughts. She grabbed the lapels of my paint-stained apron and shoved me back against the heavy drafting table. The wood dug into my lower back, grounding me, as her mouth crashed onto mine. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a reclaiming. It was desperate, angry, and overwhelmingly possessive. Her hands were in my hair, pulling me closer, while mine found the wet silk of her waist, gripping her tight enough to bruise. The contrast was intoxicating, the rough, dirty texture of my canvas apron against the sleek, expensive fabric of her clothes, the cold rain on her skin against the fever heat of my own. We were a mess of friction and taste, a conversation we had been denying for weeks, finally spoken in the language of breath and teeth. She kissed me like she was starving, like she hated how much she needed it. I kissed her back with everything I had, tasting the rain and the fear and the desire that had been eating us both alive. For a minute, or maybe an hour, the hierarchy didn't exist. There was no critic, no student, no board of directors. Just the sound of the rain and the feeling of her body pressed hard against mine, her leg hooking between mine, the friction sending sparks straight down my spine. She pulled back just enough to breathe, resting her forehead against mine. Her eyes were closed, her lashes wet, her breathing ragged and broken. "I can't do this," she whispered, her voice wrecked. "I am holding on by a thread." "I know," I breathed back, my hands still tangled in her coat. "Do it again." She did, but the second time was softer, terrifyingly tender, a lingering seal on a pact we hadn't signed. Then she pulled away completely, the loss of her warmth hitting me like a physical blow. She backed toward the door, her hands shaking as she fixed her coat, her eyes wide with the realization of what she had done. She turned and vanished back into the storm, the heavy door slamming shut behind her. When I finally peeled myself off the drafting table, my legs shaking, I found a piece of paper she had left on the desk near the door. It was a note, scrawled in her sharp, architectural handwriting. "This can't happen again." I stared at the ink, listening to the rain fade, knowing with absolute certainty that it was the biggest lie she had ever told. The secret wasn't just a memory now. It was a living thing between us, fragile, volatile, and impossible to kill. The atmosphere in the department shifted, curdling from competitive tension into something darker and more suffocating. Art students are trained to be observant, to notice the slight variation in a shadow, the inconsistency in a line. So it was naive to think they wouldn't notice us. They saw the way Elena's gaze lingered on me for a fraction of a second too long before snapping away to the whiteboard. They noticed the way I stopped breathing whenever she walked into a room. And worst of all, they noticed the grades. I was receiving top marks, not because of the affair, but because I was finally painting with the raw honesty she demanded. To them, however, my success looked like currency, purchased with secrets. The whispers followed me down the hallways, sudden silences blooming whenever I entered the print lab. It came to a head on a Tuesday afternoon during a group critique. We were circling a sculpture that looked like a car crash made of wire, discussing form and negative space. Jason, a landscape painter whose ego took up more square footage than his canvases, leaned back against a drafting table and smirked. "It must be nice," he said, his voice pitched perfectly to carry to the back of the room, "having such intensive private tutorials. I wonder what the extra credit assignments look like." The room went dead silent. My blood ran cold, then hot. I waited for Elena to shut him down, to exert that terrifying, icy authority she wielded so well. Instead, she panicked. She turned on me. She walked over to my easel, where my latest piece, a study of light hitting wet glass, was drying. She stared at it, her back rigid, her knuckles white where she gripped her clipboard. "This," she said, her voice trembling with a cold, performative rage, "is indulgent." She didn't stop there. She tore into the work with a cruelty that felt surgical. She called it derivative melodrama, emotionally stunted, a waste of good canvas. She wasn't critiquing the art, She was publicly executing our connection. She was proving to the room, and to the invisible board members she imagined were watching, that I was nothing to her. It felt like a betrayal so deep, it scraped bone. I took it. I stood there, burning with shame, and took every word without flinching. But the moment the class ended, I marched straight to her office. The blinds were drawn, plunging the room into a twilight gloom. She was sitting at her desk, head in her hands. I didn't knock. I walked in and slammed the door behind me, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the small, sterile room. "You used me," I said, my voice shaking with fury. "You threw me to the wolves to protect yourself." She looked up. She looked wrecked. "I did what I had to do. They are talking. Do you understand? The board is watching. If they think for 1 second that I am compromising my ethics..." "So you humiliate me?" I cut her off, stepping closer. "To prove a point? To save your tenure?" "I am trying to save you," she hissed, standing up. "If they think I'm favoring you, they will invalidate your degree. They will bury your work." She took a breath, her composure fracturing. "You should transfer. I can sign the papers today. Switch to Miller's section. It's safer." "Safer for who?" I demanded. "For me? Or for you?" She didn't answer. The silence was the answer. "I am not running," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly calm. "I am not switching sections. I am not letting you push me out because you're too much of a coward to handle the reality of what we did." "It's not cowardice," she whispered, pleading. "It's survival." "Then survive," I said. "But I'm finishing this thesis on my terms, with or without your support." "Fine," she said finally, her voice hollow. "But no contact. Outside of class, we don't speak. We don't meet. You are a student, and I am a critic. That is all. Deal." I walked out, leaving her alone in the dark. But the anger didn't leave me. It crystallized. I went back to the studio and destroyed everything. I took a palette knife to the indulgent paintings, scraping the canvas clean until my hands ached. And then I started over. I didn't paint what she wanted. I painted the silence. I painted the shadow of a woman standing in a doorway, the tension of a hand pulling away, the violent, beautiful bruise of a storm. I channeled every ounce of heartbreak into the final series. The thesis showcase was less of an art exhibition and more of a gladiator arena disguised as a cocktail party. The gallery was packed to capacity, the air thick with the smell of cheap white wine, expensive perfume, and the desperate, vibrating anxiety of 25 graduating students praying for validation. The track lighting was merciless, beating down on the concrete floors until the room felt like a kiln, baking the sweat and ambition right out of us. I stood by my assigned wall, my hands clasped behind my back to hide the tremors, wearing a suit I had thrifted and tailored until it looked sharp enough to cut. I wasn't drinking. I couldn't afford to dull the edge. I needed to be present for the execution. My wall was the centerpiece of the back alcove, a series of 6 large canvases titled The Silent Critic. I hadn't painted the landscape or the figure. I had painted the tension. The works were abstract but undeniably evocative. Swaths of charcoal gray colliding with violent slashes of silver. The suggestion of a mask dissolving into rain. The negative space shaped like a hand, pulling away. They were moody, atmospheric, and devastatingly honest. They were a map of every secret meeting, every withheld touch, every moment of silence that had passed between Elena and me. I had put our entire relationship on the wall, disguised as color theory, daring her to recognize it. The crowd moved in waves, a murmuring tide of donors, faculty, and critics. They stopped, they looked, they nodded, I heard words like visceral and haunting floating in the air. But none of it mattered. I was waiting for the only opinion that had the power to destroy me. She arrived late. I felt the shift in the room before I saw her. The noise level dipped, a ripple of hushed recognition moving through the crowd like wind through wheat. Elena Calloway cut through the gallery with the precision of a blade. She was wearing white tonight, a stark, architectural suit that stood out against the sea of black tie, looking untouchable and severe. She didn't stop to chat with the department head. She didn't accept a glass of wine. She walked straight toward the back alcove, the crowd parting for her instinctively. She stopped in front of my wall. The silence that fell over the corner of the room was heavy, suffocating. Students and donors alike paused, watching, waiting for the bloodbath. Everyone remembered the critique in the studio. Everyone knew she had shredded me weeks ago. They were waiting for the final blow. Elena stood there for a long time. She didn't move. She didn't cross her arms or adjust her glasses. She just stood, her posture perfect, staring at the canvas in the center, the one that depicted a storm of charcoal darkness being pierced by a single sharp line of silver light. It was the painting of the night she came to the studio in the rain. It was the painting of her fear. I stopped breathing. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. If she wanted to, she could end it right here. She could call it derivative. She could dismiss it with a wave of her hand and walk away, leaving my career in ruins. Then she turned. She pivoted slowly, her heels scraping softly against the concrete, and looked at me. For the first time in weeks, there was no wall, no mask. Her eyes were shining, bright with an emotion she wasn't trying to hide anymore. She looked at me, really looked at me, and the connection was so intense it felt like a physical touch, a hand grazing my cheek in the dark. "This," she said, her voice clear, projected perfectly so that the donors hovering nearby could hear every syllable, "is a masterclass in restraint." The breath rushed out of my lungs. She stepped closer to the painting, gesturing with a hand that was steady and elegant. Art often confuses volume with value. We think that to be heard, we must scream. She turned back to me, a small, proud smile touching the corner of her mouth. But this work understands the power of what is left unsaid. It is devastatingly honest. It is the most compelling work in the show. The crowd exhaled. The tension broke, replaced by the murmur of impressed agreement. The department head was suddenly at my elbow, beaming, introducing me to a curator from the city museum. Elena had done it. She had given me the career I had earned, validating the talent without acknowledging the muse. She had separated the art from the scandal, handing me my future with clean hands. We didn't touch. We didn't need to. As the crowd swarmed in, eager to talk to the star of the night, Elena caught my eye one last time over the shoulder of a wealthy donor. The air between us vibrated with the shared secret, immortalized on canvas, but safe in the silence. She gave me a single, imperceptible nod, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the crush of bodies. I was left surrounded by praise, holding a glass of champagne someone had shoved into my hand, feeling the hollow ache of success that meant nothing without her there to share it. The semester dissolved into a blur. Grades were posted, and the results were exactly what the department expected. Top marks, honors, and a residency offer in New York. But the real verdict didn't come from the registrar's office. It arrived 3 days later, printed on the heavy, expensive paper of the city's most pretentious arts journal. The review was titled "The Architecture of Silence." It was signed by Dr. Elena Calloway. I sat on the curb outside the studio, reading the words over and over until they blurred. It wasn't just a critique. It was a dissection of intimacy disguised as academic rigor. She wrote about the courage to remain unresolved and the beauty of friction that refuses to smooth itself out. She described my brushwork with a visceral level of perception that felt voyeuristic. To the rest of the world, it was a glowing endorsement of a promising new talent. To me, it was a love letter. It was a confession. I went to her apartment that night. I had never been there, but I had looked up the address in the faculty directory weeks ago. Her building was all glass and steel, a cold, imposing structure that looked down on the city with disdain. But when she opened the door, the armor was gone. She wasn't wearing the suit. She was in soft, unstructured linen, her feet bare against the hardwood. She looked human. "You read it," she said. It wasn't a question. She saw the journal in my hand. "I read it," I replied. "You called my composition devastating." "I wrote the truth," she said simply, stepping back to let me in. Her space was exactly as I had imagined. Sleek, minimalist, curated to within an inch of its life. The furniture was modern, the surfaces empty of clutter. But then I saw it. On her desk, framed in simple black wood, was a small charcoal sketch. It was a study of hands I had done months ago, a scrap I thought I lost. She had kept it. She had framed it. "I resigned," she said quietly, watching me look at the sketch. I spun around, the air leaving my lungs. "What?" "I submitted my resignation to the review board this morning," she said, walking to the window. She didn't look at me. She looked out at the grid of the city lights. Effective immediately. "You gave up your seat? For a student?" "No." She turned then, her silhouette cut sharp against the city glow. "I gave it up for my integrity. I couldn't grade you fairly, and I refused to grade you poorly to prove a point. So I removed the conflict of interest. I chose the only thing that mattered more than tenure." She hadn't pulled away in the studio to hurt me. She had done it to ensure that when I won, it was clean. She had dismantled her own power so that no one could ever question mine. "You're an idiot," I whispered, my voice shaking. "I'm ethical," she corrected, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. She crossed the room, the distance between us shrinking until the air felt heavy again. "And now I am also unemployed." "And available?" "That depends," she murmured, stepping into my space until I could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. "On whether you still want the critic, now that she has no power over you." I didn't answer with words. I stepped forward, closing the gap until the air felt charged again. The hierarchy dissolved. We were just two artists now. I reached out, my hands finding the warmth of her face, grounding myself in the reality. The touch was reverent. "I never wanted the critic," I whispered against her mouth. "I just wanted you." The kiss wasn't frantic like the balcony or desperate like the studio. It was slow, deliberate. It was a promise kept. Her hands settled on my waist, pulling me in, and for the first time, there was no hesitation, no looking over her shoulder for a witness, just the taste of her and the certainty that the rivalry was finally dead. The light in her apartment is better than the studio was. I'm sitting on the floor, sketching the curve of her neck while she reads, the silence between us comfortable and shared. I realized too late that the art was never about the rivalry. It was about the friction that creates the spark. If you've ever found inspiration in the most forbidden places, subscribe to follow the next brushstroke of this journey.